Fright Night.
So for my 3-year anniversary, I decided to take a little change in direction rather than revisit a previous video because mentally I'm not ready to do that. You can read all about it in the post I made in the community tab. I'm going to go over some videos that I had planned to make but just never really got around to doing. 2 years ago for Halloween, I did a review of Fright Night, a movie which I referred to as the crown jewel of vampire movies, a sentiment that really hasn't changed since then. And I had mentioned at the end of that video that despite loving the first Fright Night, I hadn't even watched Fright Night 2. I knew it existed, but I had so little interest in it that the few times I actually had the opportunity to check it out, I kept saying to myself, I'll check it out another time. And truth be told, I literally said that for like over 15 years. Over 15 years I spent just avoiding this movie, and I don't even know why. Because I never really heard anything bad about it. In fact, I never heard anything about it at all up until my mid-20s. It seemed most people were indifferent to it, and there were a few that said it was pretty good, but not as good as the original. So Fright Night 2 isn't a movie that I actively avoided watching, it was just a movie I never got around to. Other things took priority over it. And as a result, I just didn't bother watching this movie until like last Halloween when I was watching movies I wanted to review for my usual Halloween video dump. I even wrote up and recorded a whole review. I could have just reused that and edited around it, but that doesn't really fit with the way I do my reviews because all my reviews are written, recorded, and edited in a certain state of mind that is in the moment. And trust me, I would love nothing more than to just take that audio file and edit a video for it, because that was recorded and written after a first viewing. But unfortunately, the state of mind and the moment is long gone, so I figured I would just start from scratch. So today, I'm gonna make good on what I promised to do back at Halloween. I'm gonna review Fright Night 2. As for the other Halloween video that I promised and never did, Freddy vs. Jason, you'll just have to wait on that one because it factors into a whole new set of plans I have for later in the year. 1985's Fright Night was a tremendous success and a very popular movie. It was a simple tale of a kid who was obsessed with vampire movies running into a real-life vampire. And it was so deliciously 80s that it kind of just transcends the decade itself and is still awesome. That doesn't make any sense. But what I'm trying to say here is that Fright Night really did kind of set the tone for 80s horror, not slashers, horror. It was stylized and it was playing off of certain elements from classic horror and Hammer horror, but it had that 80s spin to it. Despite its whole presentation and tone being very different from the vampire movies of the 80s that followed, it's safe to say that without Fright Night there would not have been a Lost Boys or Near Dark. I've seen people call Fright Night a cult classic, but it did pretty well at the box office, so I would just go ahead and say it was successful at the box office, but its following was a cult following. But naturally, being a horror movie made in the 1980s, a sequel is more of a when than an if, and when is usually not very long. But oddly enough, there was a 4-year release gap between Fright Night in 1985 and Fright Night 2 in 1989. Granted, that's about 3 years if you factor in the fact that 2 was completed in 1988 and released in Australia in 1988, but it just wasn't released in North America until 1989 due to some distribution issues that I'm going to get to later. Producer Herb Jaffe retained the rights to the series and was interested in doing a sequel. Furthermore, director of the first movie Tom Holland was interested in returning to direct said sequel despite being a bit let down at the decreased budget. Fright Night 1 had a budget of $9 million and 2 was only getting a budget of $8 million, but Tom Holland was interested in taking the project on nonetheless. Unfortunately, Tom Holland was a bit busy in 1988 shooting another horror movie. Probably not the best idea because Fright Night was so popular, there isn't anything he could have possibly been doing that would have had more of an impact than a sequel to a movie he did before with less of a budget than the original. Okay, I'm just gonna go ahead and say it. The reason Tom Holland and Chris Sarandon couldn't commit to Fright Night 2 was because they were out shooting the first Child's Play movie. And yeah, Tom Holland made the right choice because that movie was really popular.
Don't fuck with the Chuck!
So riddle me this, when there's a horror sequel that needs a director and the original director is unavailable or unwilling to take on the task, who do you call? Tommy Lee Wallace, baby. Tommy Lee Wallace has this weird distinction of directing sequels to big or popular horror movies in franchises. And yeah, it's hyperbole to make it seem like this is his major trait, but the understudy of John Carpenter directed Amityville 2, Halloween 3, Fright Night 2, and a sequel to Vampires. So it is a little bit funny to kind of throw that label on him. He's literally the sequel bitch. Wallace worked on a script with 2 other writers, and he did actually consult Tom Holland on a few things, but for the most part, it was him and these writers that were making the movie. Chris Sarandon visited the set, but this was done without the involvement of any of the creative forces behind the original. It's literally what TV Tropes describes as a B-team sequel. The initial script, from what I can understand, called for the return of both Amy and Evil Ed from the original. Amy, played by Amanda Bierce, was written out when Bierce could not return to the series due to her commitments to Married with Children, which I could imagine was filming its 4th season at that point. Stephen Jeffries, who played Evil Ed, declined to return as he was doing gay porn. Okay, I'm joking. I mentioned he did get into gay porn, and that was a little bit later. The real reason he didn't take the role is because he was shooting as the lead in the Robert Englund directed horror film 976 Evil. So with Amanda Bierce not returning, they created a new love interest for Charlie, and with Evil Ed not returning, they created a new werewolf for Charlie. The original film followed a high school age Charlie Brewster. The sequel places him in college a few years later. Him and Peter Vincent still remain close, but Charlie has been going to therapy and is now convinced that his encounter with Jerry Dandridge was not an encounter with a vampire, and that what he was seeing was just a trauma response. There's a weird subversion with how they were doing this. In Fright Night, the dynamic was that Charlie was a fan of Peter Vincent and went to him when he was having problems with Jerry Dandridge, leading Peter to think that he was crazy, only to learn later on that Charlie was right, that Jerry was in fact a vampire. This movie is very weird with how they do it because they flop on it, and it bothers me, and I'm gonna get more into it as we go. But Charlie and Peter are still friends, but it's Peter that still believes in vampires, and Charlie has become convinced through therapy that it was all just a mental reaction to trauma and that vampires aren't real. I find this setup very cheap and serves only to prolong the movie unnecessarily and kinda set it back to the first act of where the first movie was, but reversing it, but not really committing completely to the reverse. It's one of the complaints I have with this movie. Amanda Bierce's Amy in the first movie was the perfect love interest because the dynamic between her and Charlie was pretty realistic and somewhat relatable. That is, Charlie being kind of a dork, her being kind of a preppy girl, and Charlie trying to get down and her being resistant to it at first. This is just a part of life that every teenager goes through. Charlie's new love interest, Alex, is given a weird combination of having the similar resistant dynamic, but also kind of having traits as to what Amy and Charlie's relationship would be at this point. For the first act, the Alex character is not very good, but she kind of picks up later. So the two are at Peter Vincent's for dinner, and Charlie is a little bit embarrassed by Peter Vincent going on about vampires and whatnot. And then he notices something weird, which is a shot that kind of mirrors the scene in the first movie where he sees the coffin being unloaded, but Charlie, being a good boy who goes to therapy, is in complete denial of the truth. And later on, when they're down in the lobby, Alex goes to take a dump or something, and he notices some very peculiar characters coming in. Basically, this movie's doing the thing that sequels did, where, while it is a sequel, it's rehashing a lot of the plot beats and elements of its predecessor. To its credit, it doesn't do this throughout the whole movie, but it does it enough where it's like, okay bro, like, really? But before I really get more into the movie, I do have to say, for all this movie's flaws, Brad Fiedel returning to do the score was the right choice. The score in the first movie was one of the best parts of the movie, and the sequel carries on that legacy because Brad Fiedel is an extremely talented musician slash composer. I'm not a music theory guy, like I'm not gonna be able to sit here and talk about music on like a higher level other than saying it's fucking a banger, but the scores to both Fright Night and its sequel are just plain iconic. It has a certain sleazy feel to it, like you're watching something you shouldn't be watching on cable. It's almost sensual, but it's also unsettling and kind of creepy at the same time. It's basically that goth girl who definitely has some really deep-rooted trauma and has such poor coping mechanisms about it that she's toxic, but like, fuck if she's not hot as shit. Single, by the way. What I said doesn't make very much sense, but the score is really good. It's gothic, it's definitely a horror score, but it's kind of rockin' too. Like, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't music I just tossed on and listened to from time to time. The reason I brought up the score is because it plays when we're introduced to this weird group of people who are obviously vampires, but we have to play along with the movie and Charlie's denial so that the movie actually has a forward-moving plot. Even though we already know that the extremely hot Cuban chick, my God, sorry, I need to compose myself. We get that they're vampires, and while we knew that Jerry was one in the first movie, Charlie knew, and it's a frustrating direction that they took that I find only hinders the movie. Having Charlie be in complete denial about vampires and having him not realize that there are vampires again. Like, look at this. When Alex runs off after Charlie goes too far in the car, we get to see confirmation that this group is in fact vampires, literally seconds after they're introduced. Like, right away, we see this guy, girl, fuck it, this person of non-explicit gender running a girl down on rollerblades who is in the hallway of the college campus for some reason at like 4 in the morning. And yes, there's a werewolf in this crew too, who is getting kind of creepy with the women. There's a topless scene here, and especially Alex. But he's kind of a dumbass and falls victim to slapstick. And yes, the werewolf is Uncle Rico, who oddly enough also played the human form of the werewolf in Monster Squad. Also, hey, that's Brian Thompson. I'll be getting more into the supporting cast later on. For a B-team sequel, it has a decent cast with some recognizable faces in it. Charlie's psychiatrist was played by the naked guy on the subway from Seinfeld, and the lead vampire who, Dios mio. Sorry, I will attempt to not thirst over the very hot Cuban vampire chick, and I'm probably gonna fail. The lead vampire is played by Julie Carmen, who has done a lot of work in television, but was also in the Mouth of Madness a few years after this came out, and still shows up in stuff to this day. While Charlie is sleeping off his boner from Alex giving him blue balls, the lead vampire shows up at his home, and in his infinite stupidity, he invites her into his home. I gotta say, this is a pretty good development into how he's kind of worked himself into complete denial over the events of the first movie, because Brewster would have never let someone in knowing they were a vampire. Although, in all honesty, if Julia Carmen showed up to my house and I'm looking at my door expectantly hoping that by some chance she does, I'd probably be getting bit, bros. Like, all my videos would be me trying to crowdfund blood, because beneath my tough, hard-shelled exterior, there's a complete fucking moron who would likely realize that the potential rewards outweigh the risks if a random woman dressed like that showed up to my house trying to get in. For me, the chance of a reward really does outweigh the risk, even if the risk is like a 90% chance that I'm getting turned into a vampire. Like, I will literally risk it all and lose my humanity and be cursed to hunt my fellow humans for sustenance for the rest of eternity, on the off chance that it might result in me getting to have the most disgusting, filthy, depraved, meaningless encounter with a complete stranger for free. And I get what you're saying. Is Julia Carmen that hot? Yes, she is. And it's all in the demeanor and aura rather than what's on the surface. Okay, I'm pretty sure I got that all out of my system, but no, I fucking didn't. Like, fucking Christ, that's the kind of woman you look at and the desires just flow through you. The desire to just... So yeah, the vampire bites Brewster, and the less I say about my feelings on this, the better, and then he wakes up. It was all a dream, or was it? So yeah, this is one of the more interesting aspects they put in the movie, but they don't really play up on it too much. It's having Brewster actually get bit by a vampire. In the last movie, Amy got bit and was saved, so it's pretty obvious that somewhere down the line in this movie that they're gonna do some sort of similar thing for Brewster. And obviously we're tipped off to the fact that it was not a dream due to the fact that Brewster has the actual cut on his neck when Alex returns to his dorm. That, and he's sick and has to wear sunglasses indoors while speaking to his psychiatrist. But hey, he's bowling a perfect game. Alright, so here's an interesting appearance. Charlie's friend Richie is played by Merrick Buttrick in what was his second to last film appearance, or last appearance if you don't count the Australia-only release date. Shortly after this, Merrick Buttrick passed away at the age of 29 from complications due to AIDS. And it's a little unsettling here seeing him unclothed and looking really sickly skinny, so I'm just gonna move on from this bit. Let's just say that Kirk was a little quick to blame the Klingons for this one. Okay, you have a guy who is confirmed to have had AIDS at this point in time in a movie where vampires drink his blood, and you expect me to take the high ground? I'm not gonna give you the satisfaction, but I honestly have always wondered since I figured out what AIDS was if vampires could get AIDS. So now Charlie is convinced so much that he leaves Alex at the opera to go tell Peter Vincent what he saw. And I'm thinking here they completely fucked the script up or something, because now Peter Vincent, who was convinced earlier that vampires were a thing, is just like not really convinced that there's vampires in his building. Bro, last time he told you there was a vampire, like, there was a vampire, maybe give him the benefit of the doubt. This is where the movie kind of starts to flip and flop around a bit, because Peter and Charlie go to the vampire's apartment to confront her and see if she's a vampire. And it just so happens that she's having a big party, and she does some crazy illusion shit to Charlie, which leaves him convinced that she's a performance artist. And I do think this scene's actually pretty cool. I think they showcase some interesting special effects here when Regine's face is morphing and the cross is doing a little 3D effect, and it's all perfectly backdropped by the fact that they reused the song Dream Window from the first movie. It's a nice touch, but the real kicker of this scene is Charlie remembering that he ditched his girlfriend.
She's a performance artist. There's a logical explanation. Oh my God, Alex!
And it just so happens, while Alex was waiting for Charlie to show up, when he didn't show up, she went to the opera with Uncle Rico. Sadly, Uncle Rico catches feels after, but Alex has no real intention of following it up because, bro, you're like 35.
I could have told you that.
And then after Charlie leaves, Regine is outed as a vampire by Peter, who doesn't see her reflection, and then reveals that she is in fact Jerry Dandridge's sister, explaining that she's gonna take revenge on Charlie and that Peter Vincent's punishment will be light because Peter Vincent's a coward. Now, before I go further with this, I honestly think what could have greatly benefited this movie would be to shift the perspectives and commit to it. Have Peter Vincent as the lead and Charlie as the cynic. Switch their roles completely and center the entire movie around Peter Vincent losing his show to an Elvira-like host and Peter figuring out she's a vampire. And then he has to go and try and convince Charlie to come back and help him fight her. Charlie, being in college, having a new girlfriend, really just thinks Peter Vincent's like senile or something. I just think they could have done a lot more interesting things with this movie. And I felt I should bring it up before I continue on with this review. But yeah, now we're kind of just reset back to where it was at the start, where Charlie becomes cynical and Peter is frantic. And they just play tag with this point for the entire first act of the movie, and it gives you the whole
when are they gonna get to the fireworks factory?
feeling. I'm gonna go ahead and say that the first act of this movie was not well constructed whatsoever. You get your typical hints that Charlie's a vampire, like he eats pizza that has a bunch of garlic on it and he gets sick. But after seeing that Richie was found dead, he becomes convinced that Regine is in fact a vampire and he starts snooping around her apartment. And I need to ask, like, am I just fucking poor? Well, I am poor, but like, what apartment has these huge storage rooms in like a high-rise building? I'm guessing these are supposed to be like lofts or condos or something, but even still, like, there's this whole back area network where it's just like, wow, is this what happens when you're not poor? You can get like apartments that look like that? Like, what is this? Also, like, Brian Thompson's character Bosworth is like, there's this weird guy who eats bugs, and he says their like scientific name, which was Brian Thompson's idea. But I'm fully convinced that Brian Thompson was only hired because he pissed somebody off, and as penance, they wanted to see him eat bugs throughout a whole movie.
Zoetomopsis angusticalis.
Brewster hasn't quite caught on to the fact that he's a vampire, and he goes to try and kill Regine in her coffin. He has a perfectly opportune moment to do so, but, you know, he kind of just gets mind-controlled and walks out of the place. And I'd just like to say that if I opened a coffin and found that looking at me, I'd be looking to put a different kind of wood in that vampire. Consensually, of course. And throughout the whole thing, Uncle Rico is creeping Alex again, who I guess is supposed to be some smart girl, judging by how she just kind of blasts through Bram Stoker's Dracula. But like, her whole performance is very ditzy, so I don't know like what they were going for here, and for the first half of the movie I really don't care for the love interest, but she kind of picks it up later. Okay, so I think this part may have been like a shout out to Near Dark, or like partially inspired by Near Dark. We get Uncle Rico, Brian Thompson, in the person of non-explicit gender going to the campus's bowling alley, which raises the question, what kind of college campus has a fucking bowling alley in it? All my campus had in college was a shitty food court with a bad mac and cheese restaurant, a Harvey's, and a shitty burrito place. So the cronies go to the bowling alley / pizza store and kill the owners and have a little bit of fun after hours. The whole concept of them killing the owners of this establishment reminds me of kind of a toned down version of the bar scene from Near Dark. Whether or not this was intended, I don't know, but that was the first thing that came to mind when I watched this movie. But honestly, it seems like the vampire cronies are just having a really nice time.
You should always try and pull ahead. Well, hey, it's just a joke. It's just a joke. Okay, you want to play rough with me?
So we're at the halfway point of the movie, and this is where Alex's character development starts to kind of get interesting, because after reading Bram Stoker's Dracula to try and relate to Charlie better, she's pretty much perfectly understanding of Charlie's whole fixation on vampires, and while she's not convinced that they're real, that's gonna change relatively soon. The two sit down and start watching their portable TV, where they see Regine's Fright Night, and okay, this is unfair. How do you expect me not to get thirsty in this review when there's shit like this going on? Fuck your damn confines of decency. That is a hot woman, and I would gladly get down on my knees and... So after that oddly attractive display, Charlie and Alex are attacked by Uncle Rico in werewolf form. And one of my issues with this movie is that it just jumps to the point, out of nowhere. We get 45 minutes of a relatively slow, build-up-y movie, and then all of a sudden it just kind of throws us into the climax with half a movie left. It shouldn't be jarring, but it is. There was so much hemming and hawing that I can't really get into it when it decides to jump into the whole, thick of the action. It's good, but it's by this point the movie's just kind of moseyed on, and I don't really care that much anymore. So as I mentioned, throughout the movie they're building on a subplot that Uncle Rico, aka Louie, is in love with Alex, but she does not reciprocate. I'm guessing that there are some implications here, both in and out of universe. The first implication is that this character was obviously intended to be Evil Ed, considering at the end of the first movie Evil Ed turned into a werewolf, and it's confirmed that he did in fact survive the events of it. This is actually confirmed in some sources that yes, they changed the character of Evil Ed to Louie pretty early into production. But nevertheless, the movie hinging on Jerry Dandridge's friends coming to get revenge on Charlie means that Evil Ed would have fit into this role perfectly, even going after Charlie's girlfriend. I'm guessing Evil Ed was gonna try to steal Charlie's girl, and then they were gonna have this big face-off where Charlie's just Ed, but obviously Evil Ed did not come back for this movie. And there are also characteristics of Evil Ed present with the Richie character, so I'm willing to bet any script that included Evil Ed was an early draft thing. And when they did the rewrites, they kind of just split his character traits into two different characters. That's what I'm perceiving. Now the second implication, which is an in-universe one, is that Louie the Werewolf is supposed to be a younger vampire. Again, this was probably just salvaged from whatever was written for Evil Ed, but I would guess unlike Bosworth and Belle, Louie was either turned somewhat recently or at an age similar to Charlie and Alex. Maybe he's jealous that Charlie has something that he never got to have because he lost his youth to being a vampire. This would work 100% better if John Grease wasn't a 30-year-old man when this movie was shot. And I get that, older actors playing teenagers or college-age young adults was just a thing in the 80s, but John Grease was only a few years older than William Ragsdale, who was 28 at the time. Difference is, Ragsdale could pull off being a college student. Uncle Rico looks like he's in his mid-30s and is going bald. Now, the Alex character steps it up here. Having read Dracula and learned that vampires are weakened by roses, she quickly uses them to save Brewster's ass from getting eaten, and I said what I said. So Charlie and Alex get arrested for wrecking up the library, and Peter Vincent goes insane and tries to kill Regine on live television and ends up being thrown in a nut house.
I am after a vampire, my friend. No, a real vampire, not one of those fantasy ones yet, but these idiots.
They don't believe you, do they?
No.
No, they think you're wacko, just like the rest of us.
You're right.
Yeah, well, they're the ones who are crazy, man. I believe you, Mr. Vincent. I believe you.
Alright, they kinda hit us with a pretty good twist that I really didn't see coming. Now, typically in horror movies, and what is kind of established in Fright Night 2, the psychiatrist is portrayed as a well-meaning voice of reason even if they don't quite understand what's going on. And the movie plays on this pretty well when we see Charlie with his psychiatrist, who has been reassuring Charlie that what he saw in the past wasn't real. On the surface, yeah, that's what a psychiatrist would do even if it is the truth that there are vampires, because there's no way a psychiatrist would believe that vampires are a thing. And while the psychiatrist is driving Alex to go rescue Charlie, we find out that the whole time he was a vampire, and this thing with Charlie was a long-term gaslighting operation with Regine. And the psychiatrist attempts to take out Alex, but Alex, being smart, gets his ass. Like, this part made me laugh pretty hard. It was good dark comedy.
Don't suppose you could accommodate me, Alexandra? Never mind. I know something of what you're feeling, and it's important for you to experience that. I'll take care of it myself.
He may be a vampire, but he's still a psychologist vampire, psychiatrist, whatever. So Alex uses the psychiatrist's credentials to get Peter Vincent out of the nut house, and the crazy guy from earlier does his part, and finally we get kind of a Lost Boys-esque sequence where the heroes use improvised weapons to get ready to fight the vampires. It's like a combination of improvised weapons and repurposed props from Peter Vincent's acting days, and this is kind of awesome. I wish we got a little bit more of that, but I get why they kinda didn't, because clearly the budget on this movie was just not what the first one had. And we finally get to see some impressive special effects, and they are just as impressive as the first movie. A little bit cheaper, but seeing Merrick Buttrick get blasted in the face with holy water and leak everywhere is a pretty good effect. However, I find as good as the special effects are, a lot of the other deaths are kind of anticlimactic. Uncle Rico gets shot with an oak stake.
Bullseye, dude.
And we get our final confrontation.
Welcome to Fright Night.
And it's pretty obvious, with the exception of Belle, that all the characters here are playing similar roles to characters from the first movie. Regine is obviously Jerry, Louis is Evil Ed, and Bosworth is clearly supposed to be the slime dude from the first movie. But instead, he's some dude who eats bugs, and when he gets cut open when Charlie redirects Belle's nails into his stomach, we see that he's full of bugs. I guess he's some kind of weird bug zombie. If anybody's like really up on their like Universal horror monsters lore and knows what the hell Brian Thompson's supposed to be, please leave something in the comments. Now this one I really don't understand. I know they're using like a priest's like robe or something to wrap Belle in to kill them, but why did Belle turn into a ballistic gel torso and explode like they were in a Kentucky Ballistics video? In the first movie, the confrontation with Jerry Dandridge was intense all the way, and it only ended when he got hit with the sun. And being a sequel in the late 80s, early 90s, it was only natural that they basically do the exact same thing. There's a few twists. She turns into a bat, they line her coffin with communion wafers so she can't go back in, and then Peter uses a broken piece of mirror to blast her with sun rays. It works, the effects again are very good, but it feels like this movie took a while to get going before wrapping up as fast as possible, because right here it just kinda ends with Charlie and Alex in a garden somewhere. Which leads us to our conclusion. What are my honest thoughts on Fright Night 2 after, well, my first viewing a couple months ago and after reviewing it just to write this video? I guess my final verdict on what I think about Fright Night 2 is I like it. I think it's a lot better than it has any right to be. But to play up on a cliche, all I have to really say is it's not as good as the first one. But that's fine because it does its own thing while carrying on the story from the first one for the most part. The main and supporting cast are all great. It's one of the few instances where I would argue that the supporting antagonists actually do add a positive element that was absent in the original. But other than that, it's just serviceable. There isn't anything particularly wrong wrong with the movie as a whole, but it leaves quite a bit to be desired. All the special effects and monster effects are great, but we spend so much time going through the motions of plot and establishment that we really don't get to see all that much of it. And don't get me wrong, I'm not one of those I don't like the plot people, but I find because they couldn't get Marcy back, they had to develop a whole new relationship between Brewster and Alec. And that kind of derailed the entire movie, because they had to just put time into establishing that they're a couple, whereas if they got, what's-her-face, Amanda Bierce back, they could have probably moved it along a little bit faster. Another thing I don't like is the whole back and forth thing with Brewster and Peter Vincent believing and not believing, which I went into a little bit earlier in how I'd change it. But I actually kind of find that this movie lacks when it's focused on the main characters and excels when it's focused on Regine and her cronies and even Alex later on in the movie. Sadly, they don't really know how to keep the focus on those characters for long before going back to Charlie or Peter Vincent. William Ragsdale does have a few good moments, but overall he doesn't seem like he's really into this as compared to the first movie. It's as if as an actor he didn't know how to bring Charlie up from high school age to college age, and I get that he's also playing into the vampirism thing, but I don't know, he seems kinda at half capacity here. Roddy McDowall, on the other hand, completely slays it as Peter Vincent. There is something with McDowall, in both movies, you can tell that he absolutely loves the character of Peter Vincent and loves playing this character. Even when he's kind of phoning it in, he's still, you can tell he's invested. And yeah, I guess I can finally talk about Julie Carmen without fucking her with my words, so I gotta say, she's okay as Regine Dandridge. She's menacing, she does give off final boss energy, but it's all in her aura and not so much in her performance. She doesn't really get to do much of anything to solidify herself as an antagonist. She has her cronies doing most of the evil stuff for her. Jerry Dandridge, we got to see him waste that chick in the window, we got to see him hunt Evil Ed down in the alleyway, and then the fight in the club, so it's we knew he was a threat. All Regine Dandridge does is look hot, kinda evil, kind of menacing, kind of dead in the eyes. She doesn't really give much in the way of scenes to show what kind of threat she presents. Sure, she bites Richie and she bites Charlie and does some cool illusion-related stuff that they don't really play into as the movie goes on, which I don't understand why, because that would have actually made her more of a threat. But the only threat she really presents is the threat of her henchmen, who are all really easily dispatched in the climax. But fuck if she's not hot, though. I think another thing the Regine character is sorely lacking is really any dimensions with her character. Yeah, she's hot, she's Cuban vampire mommy, but why is she Cuban vampire mommy? Jerry Dandridge was not a very one-dimensional villain. There was some sympathetic qualities to him. It's clear he really doesn't like what he became, but he's just embraced it. And it's very clear, since he sees Amy as his former lover, that there is a part of his humanity remaining and that he's trying to kind of cling on to it through Amy. He even gives Charlie a chance to walk away from the whole thing, but ultimately Charlie doesn't go for it. Jerry Dandridge is evil, don't get me wrong, but there's definitely positive qualities and a bit of a deeper character there. Regine just doesn't have any of that. Looking past how fucking gorgeous Julie Carmen is, it's a flat character. Louis and Bosworth and even Belle are characters that you can connect to a lot deeper in this movie. Regine is just I want to get revenge for you killing Jerry Dandridge, and that's really all we get to learn about her as a person, and it really doesn't help the character. It pains me to say it, but yeah, she really doesn't bring a whole lot to the narrative, besides being Cuban vampire mommy. All in all, Fright Night 2 is definitely a more competent sequel than it could have been. It could have been much worse. They kept the overall feel of Fright Night going, and while there was some rehashing of certain plot beats, it managed to kind of go in its own direction, and it is a very fun and well-made movie. One thing that was really odd to me watching it is it actually, it looks similar to the first one, on the level that the film looks the same. And this was released in the late 80s, but it looks like a mid-80s horror movie, and usually, that would be to the film's detriment, but it kind of helps it feel more in line with its predecessor. But ultimately, the best way I could describe Fright Night 2 as a sequel is competent, entertaining, but overall underwhelming. At no point do I feel like the main characters are in danger of not surviving, and yeah, I get it, they're obviously not going to waste the characters, but it feels like there's an overall lack of conflict because the movie just jumps around a little too much. I feel like they wrote a draft of a script with the expectations of getting back both Amanda Bierce and Stephen Jeffries, series, but when they realized that they weren't going to come back, they had to rewrite it, but also modify some elements of the original script to save time. It's fine, and it's kind of sad that this movie didn't do very well, and a lot of people outside of the big fans of the original or of 80s horror in general don't even really know this movie exists. And there is a reason why Fright Night 2 is a little bit obscure even to casuals who have watched the first one. And that's because Fright Night 2 was distributed by New Century Vista Pictures rather than Columbia, who distributed the first movie. Columbia's sister studio TriStar took international distribution on Fright Night 2, but for the most part this movie did not really get a wide release. It only showed on 148 screens. I'm going to assume this means worldwide and not just domestic, but it could be domestic. I don't know how many theaters there are, but nevertheless. It experienced a very limited release and was quickly yanked from theaters after a disappointing opening weekend where it only made $500K and it finished its theatrical run as a box office bomb, making only $2.9 million against its $8 million budget. Now, in the late 80s, horror was kind of starting to come off of its high. The movies weren't really doing very well, and the studios were starting to see the writing on the wall regarding the genre. It got to a point where most studios were content to just dump their horror projects into theaters, get them out as fast as possible, and get them onto home video because horror was losing its mainstream popularity. The year before Fright Night 2 was released, TriStar did the exact same thing with The Blob, which by all means should have been a huge hit. Would Fright Night have been a huge hit if it got a wider release? I don't know. I certainly think it probably would have at least made its budget back. But again, studios were just kind of done with horror. There was going to be another genre kind of moving in at some point. Roddy McDowall really wanted to do a Fright Night 3 because of his love for portraying the Peter Vincent character. And despite Fright Night 2's disappointing performance and his overall dislike with how rushed the movie was, he was more than willing to come back to the franchise. Roddy McDowall was so eager to portray Peter Vincent again that he actually set up a meeting with Tom Holland and Jose Melendez to try and get a Fright Night Part 3 made. Unfortunately, the day before the meeting was supposed to occur, Jose Melendez was found dead in his home with his wife, and it was later revealed that his sons Lyle and Eric were the perpetrators, which pretty much stomped out any hope of a Fright Night 3 happening. The 80s came to a close with horror undergoing a major change going into the 90s, and nobody really wanted to see a Fright Night 3 anymore. I don't even think anybody wanted to see a Fright Night 2, but if they did, they didn't even know it was fucking out. Because I've heard stories of people who were fans of Fright Night back in the 80s and didn't even know that 2 was a thing until they saw it sitting on a video store shelf or saw a poster of it in a video store. Nevertheless, Hollywood is really a never say never industry. Like, Fright Night 3 could have come out at any point in time, but sadly, the man who had pulled for it the most, Roddy McDowall, passed away in his home at the age of 70 after a battle with lung cancer in 1998. 12 years later, Fright Night was remade in 2010. Nobody really cared. It had a bad sequel, but in recent years, Tom Holland has been kind of expressing interest in returning to the series with the surviving members of the original cast. And to that I have to say, don't fucking bother. Like, Chris Sarandon was intended to come back for Fright Night 2 because, yeah, Jerry Dandridge is a great character, but I don't want to see, like, an 80-year-old Chris Sarandon playing a vampire now. He's really old. The whole cast is really old, and they would do the whole thing that I don't like where they just ignore the sequel because, like, oh, let's just have a fresh start from the first one. Like, no, you can't do that. That's lazy. Work around it. But even if I was 100% agreeable to ignoring the second one, what I'm not agreeable to is trying to keep this franchise going on without Roddy McDowall and without the character of Peter Vincent. I love Brewster's story, but what makes Brewster's story work is that he befriends a horror host that he likes, and they fight vampires together. Like, the idea that a horror actor turned horror host is forced to confront the fact that the movie monsters he made a name for himself facing on the big screen are 100% real. I can't see another Fright Night movie working that's a direct sequel to the first one without Peter Vincent, because the movie was Peter Vincent. He was a huge part of it. I like you, Tom Holland, but just let bygones be bygones. It's done. It's over. It's finished. Do a Child's Play movie instead. So that was my little look at Fright Night 2 and a brief discussion about why there wasn't a Fright Night 3. Would I recommend Fright Night 2? Yes, it is pretty good, but you gotta be in the mood for it because it is a bit slow and it's not really the best paced movie. But once it gets going, and it is a very enjoyable experience. third year anniversary is just starting, so stay tuned. If you like this video and are new to my channel, be sure to subscribe and take a look at some of my previous videos. You might find something you'll like. And if you have something to say to me, comment. I do respond to most comments unless you're an asshole. And if you're an asshole, you can go fuck yourself. Drop me a like, get the fuck out of here.